I still replay that moment in my mind, wondering what would have happened if I had simply walked away. People often believe betrayal begins with passion, temptation, or a reckless decision. Mine didn't. It began with compassion. I convinced myself I was doing the right thing by helping someone who seemed to have no one else. I never imagined that a few conversations, a little kindness, and the desire to ease another person's pain would slowly unravel everything I thought I knew about myself. At the time, my life looked perfectly normal from the outside. I had a stable relationship, a comfortable home, and a routine that rarely changed. Friends assumed I was happy because there was nothing dramatic to point at. But routines can quietly replace connection. My partner and I still talked every day, yet most of our conversations revolved around bills, work schedules, grocery lists, and responsibilities. We weren't fighting. We simply weren't really seeing each other anymore. I told myself this was what adulthood looked like. Relationships settled down. Excitement faded. People became busy. I accepted it without questioning whether something important had disappeared between us. Then he entered my life. He wasn't charming in the obvious way, nor was he trying to impress anyone. What caught my attention was how exhausted he looked. He carried himself like someone who had been losing battles for a long time. I later learned that his marriage had ended only months earlier, leaving him emotionally drained and struggling to rebuild his life. He rarely complained, but sadness seemed to follow him wherever he went. Our first conversations were brief and completely ordinary. He thanked me for small acts of kindness with a sincerity I hadn't encountered in years. Whether I offered advice, helped him solve a problem, or simply listened while he spoke about his difficult days, he always seemed genuinely grateful. There was no hidden agenda, no flirting, no uncomfortable tension. At least, that's what I believed. As the weeks passed, helping him became part of my routine. If he needed encouragement before a stressful meeting, I'd send a quick message. If he was having a difficult day, I'd ask how he was holding up. None of it felt inappropriate. In fact, I was proud of myself for being there when someone needed support. He never asked for too much. That was part of what made it so easy. He wasn't demanding attention. He wasn't trying to pull me away from my own life. He simply appreciated every minute I gave him, and somehow that appreciation began filling a space inside me I hadn't realized was empty. For the first time in a long while, someone listened carefully when I spoke. He remembered little details about my day. He noticed when I sounded tired. He asked follow-up questions instead of changing the subject. Those gestures were so small that I barely noticed them at first, but together they made me feel important again. I kept reminding myself that friendship wasn't a crime. Everyone deserves someone who listens. Everyone deserves compassion. There was nothing wrong with caring about another person's well-being. That was the story I repeated every time a quiet voice inside me suggested I was becoming a little too invested. At home, nothing had actually changed. My partner remained kind, responsible, and dependable. The difference was that I had stopped looking forward to our conversations. Instead, I found myself wondering if he had texted me that day. If my phone buzzed, I hoped it was him. When he thanked me for simply checking in, I caught myself smiling without realizing it. That realization unsettled me. I tried to dismiss it as simple empathy. After everything he had endured, of course, I cared about how he was doing. Anyone would. But the truth was becoming harder to ignore. His moods affected mine. Good news from him lifted my spirits. Bad days weighed heavily on me long after our conversations ended. One evening, after we finished talking, I set my phone down and prepared for bed. Everything in my house was quiet, yet my mind refused to settle. Instead of thinking about tomorrow's plans or my own relationship, I found myself replaying something he had said earlier that afternoon. I wondered whether he had eaten dinner, whether he was feeling any better, and whether anyone else had checked on him. That was the moment I realized my concern had quietly become something deeper than simple kindness. I hadn't crossed any obvious line, but somewhere along the way, helping him had stopped feeling like a choice. It had become the part of my day I looked forward to most, and I could no longer pretend that didn't mean something, if you'd like. After that night, I promised myself I would create some distance. I answered his messages a little later than usual and avoided starting conversations first. I thought reducing contact would make everything return to normal. Instead, it only made me realize how much our daily conversations had become part of my routine. He noticed the change almost immediately. One afternoon, he asked if he had done something wrong. The question caught me off guard because he sounded genuinely worried, not offended. I quickly reassured him that everything was fine and blamed my silence on being busy. It was the first lie I told, and although it seemed harmless, it opened the door for many more. I wasn't hiding an affair. I was hiding feelings I didn't want to admit even to myself. Soon our conversations returned to their usual rhythm. We talked almost every day, sometimes for only a few minutes and sometimes for hours. The topic slowly shifted away from everyday problems and into much more personal territory. We spoke about childhood memories, disappointments, fears, dreams that had never come true, and the mistakes we wished we could erase. There were conversations I had never even had with my own partner. He became the first person I wanted to tell whenever something happened, whether it was good news from work or a frustrating moment during the day. Before I realized it, I was reaching for my phone automatically. His opinion mattered. His encouragement mattered even more. At home, I started keeping my phone face down without thinking about it. If a message arrived while we were eating dinner, I waited until later to answer, not because the conversation was inappropriate, but because I didn't want questions. That secrecy bothered me. Honest friendships don't need to be hidden, yet I was already protecting something I couldn't define. He never pressured me or asked me to choose between him and my relationship. In fact, he often encouraged me to appreciate what I already had. But emotions rarely follow logic. The more comfortable we became with each other, the easier it was to overlook the invisible boundaries that had once seemed so clear. Then the compliments started. They weren't dramatic or overly romantic. He would tell me I had a calming presence, that I always knew the right thing to say, or that I made difficult days easier to survive. No one had spoken to me like that in years. I tried to laugh them off, but every word stayed with me long after our conversations ended. Without realizing it, I began comparing those moments to my own relationship. My partner wasn't cruel or uncaring, but life had made us predictable. Appreciation had been replaced by habit. Meanwhile, every conversation with him felt meaningful. I hated myself for making those comparisons, yet I couldn't stop. One evening, he mentioned that a coworker had been showing interest in him. He didn't say much about it, but I felt an unexpected knot in my stomach. The feeling surprised me more than anything else. I had no right to feel jealous. I wasn't single, and he wasn't mine. Yet the thought of someone else becoming important to him bothered me in a way I couldn't explain. That was when I finally admitted there was something dangerously wrong. I decided I needed to end whatever this had become before someone got hurt. I even rehearsed what I would say. I planned to explain that our conversations had become too frequent and that it was healthier if we focused on our own lives. It sounded reasonable in my head, but every time I imagined sending that message, I pictured the loneliness he had described so many times. I convinced myself that disappearing would only make his life harder. Once again, I chose compassion over boundaries. A few days later, we met to return something he had borrowed. It was supposed to take only a few minutes. Instead, we found ourselves talking longer than either of us expected. There was nothing unusual about the conversation, yet the silence between our words felt different. Neither of us seemed eager to leave. As we stood there, our eyes met, and for a brief moment neither of us spoke. It felt as though every conversation, every shared secret, and every emotion we had tried to ignore had suddenly become impossible to hide. We didn't kiss. We didn't confess anything. But we both understood that our friendship no longer felt like just a friendship. When I walked away, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Nothing had happened that day, yet pretending we were only friends had become the biggest lie either of us had ever told. For the next several days, I convinced myself that staying away was the only responsible choice. I stopped initiating conversations and gave myself reasons to stay busy whenever I felt tempted to reach out. Every decision was an attempt to regain control before emotions turned into actions I could never take back. The silence was harder than I expected. I kept wondering how he was doing, whether he thought I had abandoned him, or whether he had simply accepted that I needed space. More than once I picked up my phone, typed a message, and deleted it before pressing send. I knew that one conversation could pull me right back into the place I was trying to escape. Then he called. His voice sounded calm, but I could hear disappointment beneath it. He didn't accuse me of anything. He simply asked if my distance was because of him. For a moment, I considered repeating the same excuse about being busy, but I was tired of pretending. I admitted that things had become more complicated than either of us had planned. There was a long silence before he answered. When he finally spoke, he admitted he had been struggling with the same feelings. He said he had tried convincing himself that gratitude was all he felt, but somewhere along the way he had started looking forward to hearing my voice more than anything else in his day. He apologized for letting things reach that point and said he never wanted to become the reason someone else's relationship suffered. Hearing those words should have made walking away easier. Instead, they made everything feel painfully real. For weeks I had been fighting emotions alone, believing they existed only in my imagination. Knowing he felt the same removed the uncertainty, but doubled the guilt. We agreed that creating distance was the right decision. It sounded simple while we were saying it. We thanked each other for the honesty and ended the conversation believing it would be our last. It wasn't. A short time later, an unexpected situation brought us together again. Neither of us had planned it, but avoiding each other completely was impossible. We started talking cautiously, trying to keep our conversations brief and practical. For a while, it seemed like we had found a balance. The balance didn't last. The emotions we had finally admitted refused to disappear. Every conversation carried the weight of everything left unsaid. We no longer had to wonder how the other person felt. That knowledge changed every glance, every pause, and every goodbye. One evening, our conversation turned deeply personal. We spoke about loneliness, regret, and the choices that shape people's lives. Neither of us tried to justify what we were feeling. We both understood that caring about each other didn't erase the commitments and responsibilities that already existed. That truth made the moment even more painful. He looked at me and quietly said that meeting me had reminded him what it felt like to be understood. I wanted to respond with something sensible, something that would put an end to everything before it went any further. Instead, I admitted that I felt understood too. The words hung between us. In that moment, every promise I had made to myself collided with the emotions I had spent weeks trying to suppress. I wasn't thinking about excitement or escape. I was thinking about how long it had been since I had felt truly seen by another person. That realization weakened every boundary I had been trying to protect. We crossed a line we had both promised never to cross. The decision lasted only a moment, but its consequences arrived immediately. The sense of relief I thought I might feel never came. Instead, an overwhelming wave of guilt settled over both of us. We didn't celebrate. We didn't pretend it had solved anything. We simply sat in silence, fully aware that one emotional decision had changed the meaning of everything that had come before. When it was time to leave, the reality of what had happened became impossible to ignore. I drove home with a heaviness I had never experienced before. The familiar streets looked exactly the same, yet nothing inside me felt familiar anymore. As I walked through my front door, my partner greeted me with the same ordinary kindness that had always been there. That simple moment hurt more than I can describe. I answered normally, smiled when I was expected to smile, and carried on with the evening as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The hardest part wasn't crossing the line. The hardest part was looking at the life I had built, knowing that a single choice had created a secret that would follow me every single day from that moment forward. Keeping the secret turned out to be far more exhausting than living with the truth. Every morning I promised myself I would fix the situation, and every night I went to sleep knowing I had done nothing except make it more complicated. Guilt became part of my routine. It followed me to work, sat beside me during meals, and stayed with me even when the house was completely quiet. My partner didn't know what had happened, but they knew something was different. It wasn't because of a dramatic mistake or a suspicious message. It was the small changes that gave me away. I became distracted during conversations. I laughed less. I answered simple questions with short replies because my mind was always somewhere else. The emotional distance that had once existed between us became even wider, and this time I was responsible for every inch of it. I still spoke to him occasionally, but nothing felt the way it once had. The excitement had disappeared, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness that we had built our connection on a decision neither of us was proud of. Every conversation reminded us of the boundary we had crossed. Instead of bringing comfort, we brought each other guilt. One day he admitted that he no longer recognized himself. He said he had spent months rebuilding his life after losing his marriage, only to become involved in a situation that hurt someone else.
He wasn't blaming me.
He was blaming himself just as much. Hearing him say those words forced me to admit something I had been avoiding. We had both mistaken emotional closeness for something that could exist without consequences. We agreed that continuing any kind of relationship would only prolong the damage. There wasn't a dramatic argument or a painful goodbye filled with promises. We simply accepted that some connections, no matter how meaningful they feel, cannot survive the reality they create. We wished each other well and walked away carrying the same regret. Ending contact didn't erase what had happened. The silence that followed was different from before. This time it wasn't filled with hope that we might reconnect. It was filled with acceptance that the story had reached its end. The hardest conversations were the ones I had with myself. I stopped looking for excuses and finally accepted my role in everything. It would have been easy to blame loneliness, emotional neglect, or unfortunate timing. Those things explained how I became vulnerable, but they didn't excuse the choices I made. Every important decision along the way had been mine. I had ignored the warning signs because they didn't seem dangerous at the time. By the time I realized how far I had drifted, I had already crossed a line I could never uncross. Looking back, I understand that emotional affairs rarely begin with the intention to betray someone. They often begin with conversations that feel harmless, with kindness that seems innocent, and with the belief that strong boundaries aren't necessary because nothing inappropriate is happening. The danger isn't found in one dramatic moment. It's found in the countless small decisions that slowly make the impossible feel acceptable. I often think about the first day we met. If someone had told me then how the story would end, I would have laughed and insisted they were wrong. I believed I knew myself well enough to recognize where the line was. What I didn't understand was that boundaries are rarely crossed in a single step. They disappear one compromise at a time. Today, the memory doesn't fill me with longing. It reminds me of the cost of seeking emotional comfort in the wrong place. The brief happiness I thought I had found was overshadowed by months of guilt, regret, and the painful realization that trust, once damaged, is never quite the same again. If there's one lesson I carry with me, it's this: protect your emotional boundaries long before you think you need to. Don't wait until feelings become too strong to ignore. By then, the choices become far more difficult, and the consequences reach far beyond the two people involved. I wanted to help someone who was hurting. That intention was genuine. But good intentions alone don't protect us from making harmful decisions. Looking back, I understand that compassion without boundaries can become attachment. Attachment can become betrayal, and one quiet choice can change lives in ways you never expect. That's the truth I have to live with, and it's the reason I'll never again underestimate the power of the smallest decisions.